Ready.
I want to first actually thank Tyler for switching spots with me. I have a likely COVID-infected spouse at home and a son and some chickens and a dog, so life is getting very complicated at home. And I'm going to rush out of here and go there. Home is Halifax. I also want to thank Dr. Gray Morning for organizing this year's event. Last year was great, this one is also great. And finally, I do want to acknowledge that we are, because we live in Canada, on stolen land. And what I do typically at most events, but especially at events that involve Indigenous issues or topics, is I offer alternative land acknowledgements, because I have found them to be increasingly tokenistic, at least, especially in my institution. And so I typically try to read something from an Indigenous author as part of my land acknowledgement as a settler, and try to tie it into even what's going on. And I hope that's the case today. So I'll do a short reading, a few minutes before I get started. Oh, I don't have my red glasses, but I can do this. I have a confession to make. Oh, sorry, I should tell you. This is mine spread out on the ground. Are people familiar? Alicia Elliott. So Alicia's from Six Nations Grand River, lives in Brantford, so even geographically appropriate, but hopefully topically. I have a confession to make. I've never danced in a powwow, not unless you count awkward shuffle steps self-consciously made during intertribal dances, which no one should. Intertribals are when the MC invites all onlookers, regardless of experience, out of the bleachers and into their arena to dance. It's a nice gesture, but ultimately an embarrassing affair around for all. Despite my lineage and fervent passion for long braid, I am most definitely not a professional dancer. This is discouraging news, I know. After all, what kind of Indian woman can't dance to drums to please the colonial eye? Believe me when I say this was not the way I wanted it. My cousins were entered into the Grand River Champion of Champions powwow every year. I'd watch them sweating in their regalia, so painstakingly aided by my aunt. A dull envy swirling in my gut. The moment they left their outfits unattended, I appeared as if summoned by dark magic to run my fingers over the raised, precise beadwork, the velvet inlays, the feathers, the bells. This was what being Indian meant, or at least that's what I thought. I had a certain amount of it had a certain amount of pageantry to it. It was showy and fun, and judging from the number of newly bought dream catchers proudly hanging from the rearview mirrors, from their rearview mirrors, non-native Canadians seemed to agree. So imagine my surprise in 2006 during the land reclamation in Caledonia, Ontario. The same Canadians who had come to see my family members dance every year started screaming obscenity at us from their minivans, their dream catchers gently blowing in the wind as they passed our occupation. They couldn't hurl enough coffee cups or racial slurs fast enough. Our treaties didn't matter, nor did our concerns. Apparently, we were to be tolerated only in very specific contexts. We could entertain them every summer and pose in photographs with their children, sure, but attempting to assert sovereignty over our lands elicited moral outrage on par with drowning kittens. Maybe if we'd worn powwow dresses and brought a drumming group, they would have been more receptive. Again, that's Alicia Elliott, a mind spread out on the ground. So, her comments relate directly to sort of what I'm seeing at St. Mary's in terms of what level of meaningful engagement settlers are actually willing to make at our institution. So this is really my conversation with myself in some ways about my institution, hopefully a conversation with you, and about relationships and relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, or between Indigenous people and settlers. don't want to talk too much about my own experience, but interestingly, my very first time that I taught a university course was actually at Haskell Indian Nation University in Lawrence, Kansas. I was asked to come teach a course there on anthropology, and if people aren't familiar with anthropology and its relationship with indigenous communities, it's not always been awesome. And so when I walked into, especially the social sciences division at Haskell, I was the only non-indigenous person there, and I was an anthropologist. I was a settler anthropologist, and sort of coming into their space, and they were amazing to me in every respect. So just put that aside for a minute. Fast forward, I'm now involved in like a 5 or 6 year project, not as an anthropologist trying to understand indigenous ways of life or worldview, but as a concerned scholar trying to understand the experience of indigenous people as they interact with institutions of higher education. And I've been doing that for about 5 or 6 years. And in fact, RIVAS 2022 and 2023 are ongoing efforts in that regard. And I hope someone's keeping track of time. So, now let's fast forward again. I'm now at St. Mary's University for 12 years. Back a few years to where I was there for about 4 years. And I took my first administrative position as the chair of the department. This wasn't anthropology. Anthropology came second in my chair position. And so for the first time, I went to the chairs and coordinators meeting at St. Mary's University. This is all the chairs and all the coordinators from all the programs from across campus. And I walked into the room for the first time ever done this, a room about this size, times 2 probably. And I always joked back then that it was as white as a Michael Bublé concert. Now I use the acronym as white as a pickleball tournament because it's more apropos and the students understand it. But indeed, there were no people of color in the room, and certainly no indigenous people in the room. This is an important part of what a scholar at another conference in Regina recently referred to as institutional whiteness. And this has direct impacts. Multiple people at St. Mary's understand this story, or they've experienced it, were frustrated, and it's one of many. But we actually had 2 white philosophy faculty members who wrote and published 2 scathing sort of ad hominem attacks, first on the only indigenous scholar in our Faculty of Arts at the time, and then on a student who was an indigenous student in one of their classes. These were published through a quasi-academic publication and circulated. And you don't need to read them, just know they were direct attacks, unfounded on both of these people. And subsequently, the indigenous scholar left St. Mary's, leaving us in the Faculty of Arts at the time with not a single indigenous scholar in the entire faculty. We now have 1 faculty member in our Faculty of Arts that's indigenous, and we also have 1 person in the Faculty of Science out of 280-some faculty. So I also want to take a minute and give a broader perspective of St. Mary's, because indeed our inability to take things meaningfully does not stop at our engagement with indigenous people and communities. St. Mary's has a very long track record of having a lovely website, lots of things splashed on that website, and a significant lack of substance when it comes to actually doing the work that needs to be done to make those splashy things meaningful for students and surrounding communities. So this is what's a big part of the problem with our engagement with indigenous communities and people, but it's also part and parcel of St. Mary's drive, more broadly speaking. We ran a food drive. Food drives are problematic in and of themselves. St. Mary's actually ran a food drive that was called the Hunger Games for multiple years. So this is the kind of thing that happens at an institution that doesn't actually think it's itself through hardly anything. And it's ongoing and very consistent. Okay. So the title of my talk is actually, it derives from Frida Hewson, who is one of the really important people involved in the Wet'suwet'en attempts to keep pipelines off of their land. Some of you may know the story. If you don't know the documentary, in particular Invasion, I highly recommend it. It shows the Wet'suwet'en effort to keep pipelines off of their land. And Frida repeatedly talks about and asks the question, is reconciliation dead in Canada? And I think that's a really important question to keep asking. I'm especially interested in asking about my institution. And the language is important. Multiple people, both last year and this year, and in other places I've been, have interrogated these ideas like reconciliation, decolonization, indigenization. What do they actually mean on the ground? And for me, I'm borrowing in some ways from Frida and recognizing that, yes, those terms are sometimes hard to wrap our minds around, even harder to implement practices meaningfully based on them. But one thing's for certain, universities, especially mine, are colonial institutions, and they're controlled by settlers. Those two things are factual to a point where, regardless of the language we use to try to improve them, the point remains we need to improve our institutions, mine in particular, which means improving and working on those two aspects. It's colonial in nature, it's controlled by settlers. So how do we change this? And this is the question that I'm grappling with, along with, probably about a dozen other faculty members at St. Mary's, two of whom, and only two of whom, are Indigenous, because they're the only two Indigenous people on our campus, identifying Indigenous. This, of course, brings up a lot of issues that are really challenging when you're trying to do the work that needs to be done, because how do we do it without overburdening the Indigenous faculty on our campus, which is very hard to do at St. Mary's, given the tasks, the monumental tasks, and the very small number of Indigenous faculty. You can't see it directly, but this is a picture from the anthropology office, the main office, and I'll point. You can see actually the Ukraine flag right there. But just over to the side, the white one is actually the Mi'kmaq flag that we've been flying for quite some time. Answering that question, what do we do to fix what's going on at St. Mary's, maybe at all institutions? While challenging in the specifics, part of it's actually not that challenging to get to. One of the things that we need to do as an institution is admit that we have failed dramatically in improving relationships between Indigenous people and our institution, our colonial settler institution. I actually am of the opinion now, and a couple of the people I know in our group share this opinion, that we shouldn't be flying the flag at St. Mary's. I don't think we deserve to fly the Mi'kmaq flag at St. Mary's because we've not made a commitment to actually improve our relationship on any substantial level. So why are we flying the flag? And who's it benefiting? And I think that's a really important question, because I don't think it's benefiting Indigenous people as much as it is assuaging settler guilt about what's going on, without us actually admitting we've failed, because we have failed. Should there be a moratorium on a lot of the activities that we bring to campus? Because in a very surface level way, we engage with a variety of practices that are Indigenous-led. But these are things that are mostly ceremonial in nature, performative in nature. I don't think they're unimportant. I think those things are important. But if an institution hasn't shown a general commitment to actually improve those two things, i.e. colonial nature of the institution and the stranglehold that settlers have on it, are we actually doing any good by bringing these things onto our campus? It seems a whole lot like false advertising when we do so. More stuff from our website. There's actually inaccuracies here because clearly no one has actually cared enough to take time to look at these things. So this is the section on our website that St. Mary's for Indigenous students. And down at the bottom we offer a minor in Indigenous studies. We don't offer a minor in Indigenous studies at St. Mary's. We we don't have the resources, the faculty, or the funding. We splashed it on our website starting about 10 years ago. Faculty concerned about this have been fighting it because we don't feel like we have the right to offer an Indigenous Studies program, nor the resources to do it. And so they finally have basically stalled the program, but it still appears in lots of places online, and we're not even really sure what it means to cancel a program like that. But we've had multiple scholars, one of whom is Indigenous, review our capacity to offer Indigenous Studies minors, and it simply is not there. Okay, so how much time do I have left?
You have, you started, you have 20 minutes, so you started at 10:30 and you got 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll go quickly through some of the major problems, suggest a couple of solutions, and then we can chat. Major problems. Indigenous Studies minor, I've also already mentioned. A small number of Indigenous staff, faculty members too. Lack of a meaningful commitment from our leadership. And so lack for what? Well, I would say at the start we have to start thinking about governance and funding. Do we, and to be clear, there's no pool of money, there's not a penny set aside at St. Mary's for Indigenous issues, Indigenous initiatives. No money. I've asked repeatedly year after year, why don't we have a fund if we're going to do something like even just bringing in Indigenous scholars to provide guest lectures? Why is there no funding available for this? Why every time I do this as a faculty member do I have to come crawling to some administrator and ask them to like wade through the mess that is their budget and find $2,000 to bring in Indigenous scholars? Why is there not money set aside? We get no answer, year after year after year. Governance. Brought this up yesterday briefly. We have an advisory board to the president. That advisory board was handpicked by the president. There's lots of good people on that board, but what's their role and what can we expect from them? Are they anything other than the president checking off his checklist of like the committee we meet twice a year? Are they actually involved in governance? I'm almost certain that they're not. Nobody else at St. Mary's in any position of power has an Indigenous background. So governance is an issue. There are multiple other small things. We, for example, had two positions that the president created to bring in a visiting scholar and a revisiting researcher. These were like 6 or 8 month or something like this, like relatively short programs. Well, first of all, they sent us, because there were basically a group of concerned settlers, the advertisements, and they actually did the things that we were pointing out not to do. And I'm not sure what the general feeling is about this, but in my opinion, and Lori Campbell from Regina actually says if they're asking you, if they're looking for an Indigenous person to come to campus, you shouldn't go. If that's the purpose, if they're just trying to fill a slot, don't go, especially if they're not prepared. But in addition to that, we were arguing, listen, if an Indigenous scholar is going to come to our campus and we're inviting them, they don't have to work on Indigenous issues. They can be a chemist who works on chemistry. They can be someone who is involved in any sort of practice, academically speaking. Why is it seems very essentializing that if you're Indigenous, you have to work on Indigenous issues. And we asked for the president to change this. He refused to change it. Then we put the ads out under protest. No one applied. Quite literally, the cat was already out of the bag. St. Mary's had already been known as an institution, failing in almost every respect to respond meaningfully to the TRC. No one applied for these positions. We literally had to hunt down people, find them, and one person finally applied to the position. And he was great. But again, lots of issues there. Possible solutions. We finally formed, for the first time ever, a working group with the goal of establishing a permanent committee for Indigenous engagement at St. Mary's for the first time ever. We've had decades to do this, and finally we're on track to be clear, it's not done. We have a working group to get there. Resources and funding and a commitment to improve content at SMU in general are things that we're proposing as a part of this committee. We're trying to grapple with this fact that we have an Indigenous Studies minor listed, but don't have the capacity to do it. And we're switching instead to settler studies as a possibility. And I think those are a really important part of our possible correction here. So this would include stuff like the work by, I don't know if you know her, anthropologist Eva Mackey. She actually does ethnography of settlers resisting indigenous land claims. She goes to the community meetings, she goes to the picnics, she goes to the backyard discussions, and looks at the very, organized and I would say violent attempts to stop land claims from indigenous people. Eva's settler. You also have people, you can't see her name here, but like Emily Grafton at the University of Regina, who's an indigenous person who studied settler colonial discourse in a number of ways. These are the things that I think our university should be promoting and doing and providing resources for, to understand settler colonialism in meaningful ways so that students who come to St. Mary's leave understanding what settler colonialism is and what their role in it is. Are we ever going to get to a point where St. Mary's would offer a mandatory study on Indigenous, like an Indigenous Studies course? I don't know. Actually, I have mixed feelings about even doing that. From my experience with talking to Indigenous scholars, oftentimes making those courses mandatory for first-year students backfires quite badly in a number of ways. So those are the things that we're proposing. We have some issues around labor. We're trying to get channels for Indigenous scholars to come to St. Mary's where they don't have to follow the same rules as non-Indigenous scholars. Say, for example, through unions. This has been very difficult. We feel like it's not a lot like the lobster dispute. Why would Indigenous fishermen in Nova Scotia listen to the federal or the provincial government around fishing lobster when those institutions have overseen and promoted the complete destruction of our oceans? Why would Indigenous people listen to either the provincial or federal jurisdictions around those issues? Same thing goes for teaching at a university. My university sits on Indigenous land. Why would an Indigenous person need to follow the rules that we created to enter that institution? So in very simple ways, we're asking QB to create another track to bring in Indigenous scholars that don't require the same, actually really dumb processes that are required to bring in non-Indigenous people. And QB is pushing back like crazy. They don't want to give up that power. I'll stop there and open it up for